There's something chilling about knowing exactly how a story ends before it even begins. This one ends in a prison courtyard with a guillotine, but it begins with a leaflet. And today we're talking about Sophie Scholl, a 21-year-old German student executed by the Nazis for handing out pieces of paper. But those pieces of paper weren't just leaflets. They were resistance, and that in Hitler's Germany was a death sentence. This story feels recent, because it is. This didn't happen in the Dark Ages. This was a modern, educated, industrial nation silencing one of its brightest young voices because she refused to be quiet. Now, Sophie Magdalena Scholl was born in 1921 in Fürstenberg, Germany. She was the fourth of 6 children, raised in a household steeped in Christian values and liberal politics, and her father, Robert Scholl, was openly critical of the Nazis. Sophie was artistic, deeply thoughtful, and passionate about ethics and justice. She loved reading and painting, and often questioned authority. Like many of her peers, Sophie initially joined the League of German Girls, the female wing of the Hitler Youth, but she quickly became disillusioned. The slogans, the obedience, the blind nationalism, it clashed with everything that she believed in. Her moral compass, guided by her Christian faith and her philosophical interests, led her away from conformity and towards resistance. In 1942, while studying biology and philosophy at the University of Munich, Sophie joined her brother Hans and a small group of fellow students in what would become one of the most famous resistance movements of the Nazi Germany, the White Rose. The group included Hans Scholl, Alexander Schmorell, Christoph Probst, Willy Graf, and their philosophy professor Kurt Huber. They wrote and distributed leaflets condemning the Nazi regime, denouncing the genocide of the Jews, and calling for passive resistance from the German people. These weren't impulsive, angry rants, they were eloquent, intellectual, and steeped in German philosophical tradition. They quoted Goethe and Schiller and referenced Aristotle and the Bible. One leaflet read, "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose does not leave you in peace." They knew the risks. Every copy they printed, every address they posted to was a gamble with their lives. And then, on February 18th, 1943, Sophie and Hans arrived at the university with a suitcase full of the 6th leaflet. They placed copies outside of lecture halls and along corridors. And then Sophie did something bolder. She climbed to the top of the atrium staircase and flung the remaining copies into the air. They fluttered down like snow, a peaceful protest made terrifying by context. A janitor, Jacob Schmidt, saw them. He was a loyal Nazi and reported them to the Gestapo, and then they were arrested on the spot. In custody, Sophie at first denied everything. But when incriminating evidence was found in Hans's room, including a handwritten draft by Christoph Probst, the story collapsed. And rather than save herself, Sophie took responsibility. During interrogation, she said, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare to express themselves as we did." Now, their trial took place just 4 days later, on February 22nd, 1943, at the infamous People's Court, presided over by Judge Roland Friesler. Friesler was known for his brutal, theatrical trials filled with yelling and humiliation. This one was no different. There was no defence lawyer and no chance of mercy. Now, the trial only lasted a few hours. Sophie stood calmly throughout, challenging the court's logic. She didn't plead, and she did not back down. The verdict: guilty of high treason. Sentence: death by guillotine, to be carried out that very day. Their parents were only informed after the trial, and Sophie's mother, Magdalena, visited her daughter in prison and told her, "Remember Jesus?" And Sophie replied, "Yes, but you too." They were then taken to Stadelheim Prison in Munich, and at 5 p.m. that evening, Sophie was led to the guillotine. She refused a blindfold, and she walked with composure. Her last words were recorded as, "Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter, if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Hans was next, and as the blade fell, he shouted, "Long live freedom." Christopher Probst followed after being baptized in a final act of faith. 3 students executed within minutes of each other. The executioner said he had never seen anyone face death as bravely as they did. The Nazis thought they had silenced a rebellion, but they had created martyrs. The 6th leaflet, the one they had distributed that morning, was smuggled out of Germany and reached Britain and was reprinted by the Allies, and in July of 1943, millions of copies were dropped over Germany by aircraft, renamed the Manifesto of the Students of Munich. Today, Sophie Scholl is one of the most celebrated figures in modern German history. There are schools, streets, statues, and films in her name. And in 2003, she was voted the 4th greatest German of all time in a national television poll, behind Konrad Adenauer, Martin Luther, and Albert Einstein. Her face appears on stamps, her words are etched into stone, and her story is taught in every German classroom. Now, we often talk about standing up for what's right, but few of us ever have to do it at such a cost. Sophie Scholl didn't fight with weapons. She fought with a typewriter and a belief that truth matters, even when it's dangerous. She was 21. She had her whole life ahead of her. She could have stayed silent, but she chose to act. And sometimes a whisper in the dark is more powerful than a scream in daylight. Thank you for watching, and if you want more stories about those who dared to resist, to speak, and sometimes to die for it, make sure to subscribe. This was Off With Our Heads. I'm Sky, and I'll see you next time.